Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Kelsey Prihoda, and I'm the Great Lakes Transportation Extension Educator with Minnesota Sea Grant, the lead organization of the Hazardous Material Transport Outreach Network, or HazMaTON. Our network is a binational collaborative of specialists from the Great Lakes, Lake Champlain, Hudson River, and St. Lawrence River regions, focused on reducing risks associated with multiple modes of oil and hazardous material transportation. HazMaTON is committed to the dissemination of accurate, neutral, and data-driven information through education, outreach, and relationship building, all in an effort to improve public safety, the region's economy, and environmental stewardship of our water resources. To that end, we welcome you to the September presentation of HazMaTON's 2023 Summer Webinar Series. These webinars have taken place monthly since May. Today's webinar is about the Natural Resources Canada CanmetENERGY facility and the science research being conducted there to answer questions on the behavior of oil in fresh water. Before we get started and I introduce our speaker, I have a few logistics to share with you. First, this webinar is being recorded. The recording with closed captions will be made publicly available in the coming weeks on Minnesota Sea Grant's YouTube channel and on the Hazardous Material Transport Outreach Network's website. We invite you to submit questions, comments, and/or any technical challenges you may have at any time via the question and answer box in your Zoom toolbar. You can upvote questions that you are interested in having answered live. We will be collecting those for the question and answer session that will take place following the presentation. Okay, so it is my pleasure to introduce to you all Dr. Heather Dettman. Dr. Heather Dettman has been a research scientist with Natural Resources Canada, or NRCan, since 1990. She has developed expertise in analyses of petroleum, including oil sands bitumen, and has applied this knowledge to address specific research topics for refinery corrosion, petroleum upgrading and refining, refinery process upsets, bioprocessing, and diesel fuel analysis. In 2013, Dr. Dettman led the creation of oil spill science facilities and projects at the NRCan CanmetENERGY Lab in Dettman, Alberta. In 2022, Dr. Dettman became the Senior Science Advisor for the NRCan Multi-Partner Research Initiative, a research funding program aiming to help the Canadian and international spill science community address priority response knowledge and technology gaps. Today, Dr. Dettman will provide an explanation of the science, research, and development capabilities of the CanmetENERGY facility in Dettman, Alberta, and share insights gained from meso-scale tank tests of oil spills into freshwater. Dr. Dettman, the floor is yours.
For our facility in Dettman, Alberta, which is just a little bit south of Edmonton, this research lab has been in place for about over 30 years, actually, where it started as a coal research facility and then evolved into sort of an oil sands research facility. However, all along, we've been aiming at mitigating environmental impacts from oil production or oil refinery, or even for the transportation fuels that are produced from it. And so we have diverse kinds of feedstocks that we're working with. We end up working with industry a lot. We work with academia, governments. And so we are a mixture of chemical engineers, chemists, microbiologists, analytical perspectives, process. We have little unit, largest unit, I think, is about 2 barrels a day kind of operation, right through to the lab, just a few milliliters. So we really have a very integrated group. The pilot plants, like the little refinery stuff, is service to everybody, and also includes routine analytical. Then we have an upstream environment group, downstream and renewables group, and then over the last couple of years, we now have the multi-partner research initiative, which is a GNC program for funding oil spill research. And so, as you can see from the topics here, we aim to reduce the GHG emissions and environmental impacts, particularly around production and finding new fuels side. Because we have these facilities, then people can come to us to use them, to test out their new idea, greatest for kinds of feedstocks, or whether it's bio oils or other kinds of tall oil from pulp and paper industry, these kinds of feedstocks. So we're modifying as we're getting more into wanting to have low carbon fuels. They're screening low carbon fuel alternatives. We have a whole lot of heavy oil resources up here. Those oils can actually be used more than just burning them. And so looking for new materials, let's say, that we could use, say, the bitumen for. As I mentioned, we have the lab to pilot scale. And then finally, our oil spill programs are supporting Canada's spill response regime, aiming for pollution preparedness, response, and recovery from coast to coast to coast, because we have the Arctic. Okay. Oh, there we go. Good. Okay. So with the a little bit about the downstream and renewables group, they're looking at bioenergy and biofuels, different types of fuels coming from different sources, including the carbon capture and storage, e-fuels, using hydrogen, making use of methane emissions. And whatever fuels you have, in the end, you have to optimize the engine and the fuel composition for the cleanest burning of that. And so we've been doing this for 25 years. We're just changing what type of engines we're using and what kind of fuels we're using. So the liquid feedstocks are from petroleum and bio sources, and this work is funded by the federal government within Natural Resources Canada. We also collaborate with province, territories, international government agencies, including US agencies. We've been working with DOE for 15 years, I think, on this clean fuels topic, and then also private sector for fee for service. Now for bioenergy, I won't say too much about, in the end, you can look at these slides to see it, but various types of projects, and these actually change according to who wants to work with this. The idea of biogasoline, biodiesel, renewable diesel. And again, technologies are trying to improve the refineries or test engines that are using it. We can work with them on that. We also have a whole very detailed analytical for these kinds of compositions. And so that can then get used for modeling for engine performance. For the e-fuels, this is something new, the idea that you are using the CO2 and basically recycling the CO2 with hydrogen to produce kerosene, say, for instance, type fuel that gets burned, that generates the CO2, and the idea that can be recycled. So working with various companies that are doing this, different organizations that are different, interested in doing that. And then finally, this whole analytical part is very important to stay up with, because you need the techniques to be able to know what you're creating, to know whether it's working or not. So if you can't analyze it, you don't know what you've done. And so those methods are always being developed. And again, with various industry and government organizations. The second research group that they have is the upstream and environment research group. And so with that, there's a whole bunch of topics that have come up in here, going from extractive technologies to tailings research, which is a byproduct from bitumen. Then environmental geoscience, the idea of once you reclaim it, it's not really reclaimed until the land can be used again how it was before. So how can you do that? And then since 2013, we've added in the aspect of the spill science, where we have spill tanks that I'll talk about a little bit later, to be able to do meso-scale kinds of tests. So you can actually allow all the processes that happen in a spill to happen so that you can actually see what's going on. They're also doing some work to do with the energy transition, different from the downstream group. This is more in the field kind of considerations. And then, of course, As soon as you're doing any of these things, you want to have the modeling and simulation. Again, using the data to have an idea whether you're making it better or worse. And so some of the funding, again, we have the internal NRCan funding that's working on remediation, reducing water impacts and usage, improving contaminant leak detection methods, and doing selective oil spill research, where we are working and developing Indigenous partnerships for projects that of their interest. We also have the carbon capture and storage, trying to improve that efficiency for capture. If you're going to have hydrogen, well, you need to store it. What's important for understanding underground storage of hydrogen. And then we had now in the last few years have capability for doing microbiology of these whole things to figure out what the biodegradation is doing, as either when things are spilled or whether it's good or bad. Some technologies want to make use of what the microbes are doing, and so we look at these from all angles. Okay, and then finally, in terms of contaminant studies, looking at the environmental impacts on water from biofuel pipeline leaks, transformation viability of acidic compounds in oil sands brine. If you have a spill of oil, if you solidify it, does that help with cleaning it up? If you have slop oil treatment using, can you basically recover the oil by using certain solvent techniques? For the environmental impacts of land, doing pre-treatment of tailings with biosurfactants, if that helps with the whole separation process to separate the water from the sediment. Biosensor development and experimental simulations. Oops. Okay. Oh, I just discovered, sorry, the wheel works on this. All right. Anyway, from the ocean protection plan side, they do have some funding where they're specifically looking at the HNS, the hazardous and noxious substances, fate and behavior. There's been a lot of emphasis on what happens when oil goes in water, but of course, petrochemicals, pesticides, every industry has giant quantities of something that can go in the water, and to start to understand those processes, particularly for us, for organic compounds, because that's our expertise is with organic compounds. So we're starting to look at that, the idea of biofuels, how to deal with the plastics and microplastics, and recovery. Can we do recovery of those or mitigate impacts? And then finally, there was a project to do with the Arctic, looking at the Arctic, where to understand oil spill behavior in the Arctic. In the Arctic, there are natural seeps that are putting oil in the environment, and as well with increased shipping possibilities through the Arctic, that's greater chances for spills. And so how will the Arctic work with that? What would be the most sensitive areas? Are there parts that need to be part of marine conservation where they just can't go to preserve them because it would be detriment. Well, it's not good, but they have the poorest opportunity to recover, and so try to find those spots that are the most sensitive and preserve them. Okay, so then the last area that we have is funding the multi-partner research initiative. Now, this originally, I'm now associated with this, so I'm not active in the lab anymore. I don't have any staff now, so I guess I'm in a more restful place from having had a group of about 12 before. Anyway, but with this MPRI, we are actually a funding group. It was originally created by Fisheries and Oceans Canada 6 years ago, I guess, under the first round of Oceans Protection Plan, where they had funding to basically help the Canadian and international spill response community develop larger projects, basically little networks to deal with specific issues, to really try to push it forward, either for knowledge or for technologies. And so the first 5 years went well, but then they decided, like with fisheries and oceans, they're focused on the oceans, and so there's this whole lot of inland part, where there's pipelines, where there's the Great Lakes, that were being not considered under their programs. And so at that point, when we went for renewal, they then gave it to Natural Resources Canada, so that we now have the jurisdiction for pipelines and as well as offshore. So we end up covering everything, which means we now have a program to cover both inland, like St. Lawrence, Great Lakes, coastal kinds of projects. And so with that, our research themes have kind of broadened from the DFO themes. And so we're including oil, fate, and behavior transport, response planning and decision-making, to help with physical recovery of oil, try to further the understanding of biological effects of oil detection and monitoring, and then in situ burning and spill treating agents as an area of possible extra tools for use. At the moment, these tools cannot be used in Canada without getting official approvals, and so it's so we haven't used them in Canada. And so with that, the point is to increase knowledge, develop new technologies, and maybe even methodologies to improve it. We have our Canadian spill response regime, and so we want to inform the regulatory and development of support science-based decisions. So basically, they have the knowledge to develop better models, so that when a spill happens, we can make the responders can make the most informed decisions as to how to treat the spill to mitigate damage. And so the other beauty about this is that it's sort of a win-win. Like, it's Canadian government funding. The projects have to include Canadian researchers in it, but yet we encourage and promote that the international groups be involved as well. So it helps train the spill response community of the future for Canada, but it helps everybody else too, because everybody brings their best tools together, and then everybody learns. So in a way, it's kind of supporting improvement for the world by us having our little pots of money to go towards this. So again, training is very important. Most of the projects are run by academics with their grad students. With that, we to have an exchange of knowledge. Industry is often involved. We really encourage and insist that the responders be part of it, to really make the research focused for what's needed by the responders. And in the last, we are making a very active push to actually have Indigenous participation, and we have had like one of the projects that will be funded is actually led by an Indigenous group, and most of our projects have at least some Indigenous participation, and we're trying to build on that, because for spills, like we say, oh, it's out in the wilderness, but guess what? That's where the Indigenous peoples, that's the Indigenous people's homes. So they have we want to help to braid Western science with Indigenous knowledge, so that everybody can understand and work to find the best ways of preventing or mitigating or rerouting or whatever would to make it work for everybody. So this is relatively new, but well, we had to start sometime. So anyway, and then of course, engaging the oil spill responders. They are part of our teams. There's not a lot of spill response organizations, and I think all of them are involved in some way with some of the projects, which is a great place to be. Okay. All right, and just for the administrators in the audience who are sort of interested in how you'd run a funding program like this, I have one slide, and it's kind of a novel way, I guess. So we had our announcement that we had the funding, and then we had senior management steering group from the various departments in Canada that are involved to be our steering committee, who approved our topics for research. We then put together an advisory committee that included experts, international, Canadian, to again look at the list and to make comments on the list. So we came up with our final lists. Then we had our call for proposals. This year it happened between December to the middle of January. And from that, we ended up getting 51, I think, proposals, which I'll talk about. And so then we had expert advisory committee. From there, they did the peer reviews. And then from that, we came with our final selected proposals. And with that, there was recommendations on how proposals might be tweaked. And so we actually gave comments back for how they could improve it. They don't need this part of it. They maybe add a bit more of this, go talk to that person, because we're trying to encourage the networks. And then finally come to the final version of the proposals, which we then had approval from an advisory committee, again, the senior people from the departments, and then our ministers were briefed on what's happening. And then contribution agreements have been negotiated, and then we have to get our ADM to approve it. And so at that point, it's an active project and it starts. So at this point, we've close to spending all the funding we have for the 4 years. But things get tweaked as they go, and if money gets released because some can't use it or whatever, then we might go through the whole cycle again to continue to use it. And so as an overview, we had, I believe, 54 proposals. Of the 54, 21 were chosen. And so we end up having 3 proposals in the fate and behavior category, 5 proposals on alternate response measures, 3 on oil detection and monitoring, 6 on biological effects of oil, 3 on physical recovery of oil, and then 1 that's aiming to improve response planning and decision-making. And at the moment of the 21, I believe we have 10 contribution agreements signed to date. And the communications people are just preparing the package. I actually had it all figured, nice slides with pretty pictures of the organizations. And some of you out there got funded, and so you will know who you are, but I can't tell everybody else yet. So we do have some Great Lake projects that got funded. And soon we will have our announcement so that we can then talk about it and give more details. But at the point, this is all we can do. Okay. So now that was the sort of the overview part. Now I'm doing, well, not too bad, I guess, maybe. Anyway, so now we'll go on to the technical question. I want to give an example of how we kind of tackle questions. Now, I mentioned that we have this diverse group of researchers working together, from chemical engineers right through to microbiologists. And so that means when we tackle a problem, especially when there's water and oil, it has a whole lot of possibilities for how you can look at the system. And so as I was leading it, I did my best to have everybody look at it. So it was slow to do the work, but now as we get the papers out, we basically had, say 24 test tank runs, but from it we have toxicity and microbiology and analytical and behavior and different temperatures, different oils. So it's kind of, I can probably spend the next 10 years writing papers on it. But anyway, for now, because you're such a diverse group of people, I figured I'd just start with sort of a petroleum 101. I find that when I talk to people, even people that are technical themselves, there tends to be misunderstandings about what petroleum is and what's in it and stuff. And so I figured I would just kind of give a little crash course on it. And one of the paper that I'm lead author on that you'll see is we actually wrote a whole paper. It's like a petroleum 101 paper for toxicologists, but it would be relevant to biodegradation people too, because it really explains what's in there and really can help to decide the sort of the future for where research needs to go in these areas. Anyway, so petroleum was the original biomass. It was biomass to begin with. And then just to sum it up, and I apologize to the geologist in the crowd, but I'll just say it's geologically aged biomass. So it was in the ground under pressure, temperature. And the main thing is that it cracked the larger molecules into smaller molecules and got rid of their oxygen a fair bit. So you end up with what you have in crude oil. So when you have the unrefined petroleum, so as it comes out of the ground, it's a complex mixture of organic compounds that have boiling point ranges. And I'm just giving, they start boiling around 36 degrees, and I'm saying 36 to 204, that's volatile organic compounds. And gasoline is an example of a product that's in that boiling range. Then you can have 204, and I apologize to US people, and centigrade here. My next slide has Fahrenheit. But anyway, 204 to 343, that's the diesel fraction range. And the 343 to 524, that's a bunker B kind of range. And those together, that whole boiling range is what we call semi-volatile organic compounds. And then finally, beyond that, which are then the largest molecules, bigger than 40 carbons big, is a vacuum residue, and people will know what that is because that's asphalt on the road or roofing tile, roofing asphalt. And if you want to see kind of compositions and information about the Canadian crude oils, Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers has a website where you can look up the various oils that go in the pipelines in Canada and out of Canada. Okay, so in this particular one, I tried to illustrate this whole thing. So over here, just what's in crude oil is what you're used to seeing here. So it starts down, well, in this case, you can have butane in your Bic lighter, going to the gasoline and diesel that you use in the car, getting into the marine fuels kind of area, going finally to the asphalt. And so all of those things are contained within crude oil as it comes, as it's moving. For if you want to do technical side of things, these gives the boiling temperatures, Fahrenheit, centigrade, and I gave examples of, there's 2 diluted bitumens, the Access Western Blend, Surmont Heavy Sinbit as a different one, and Bakken, which many of you would know. And these gives the content of how much is in there and the boiling temperature. So the Bakken, even the Bakken has heavier material, bigger material in it, but it only has, say, 10% that boils above 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit compared to the diluted bitumens being roughly 50% boiling above 1,000 degrees. So the oils all have these same kind of species in it. It's just different amounts. Okay. So then this other concept that I wanted to introduce. So you have these different kinds of compounds. In terms of sizes, I talked about the boiling, and that's how refineries end up creating products, is based on boiling. But this boiling also, in terms of sizes of that, their sizes go from C4 for butane, C5 is for the liquids, starting with liquids, to over 120 carbons in size. So there's a whole bits of, the fragments, polymer fragments here, going from 5 carbons to over 120 in size. Now, some of these compounds contain only carbon and hydrogen. And those are what we call as hydrocarbons, while others contain heteroatoms such as sulfur, nitrogen, and a little bit of oxygen even. These categories are important. The oil can be subfractionated based on these categories, depending on how much aromatic rings they have in it and how much they have of those heteroatoms of the sulfur, nitrogen, oxygen. And so really, they're calling it, you can separate subfraction parts of the oil into more or less polar, which means more or less water soluble. As things become more polar, then they're more easily dissolving into water compared to something that's less polar, then it's less soluble. Okay, so the least polar, the ones that don't like water at all, want to stay out of the water, no aromatic rings, no heteroatoms, and they're called saturates. Then little bit aromatic rings, but no heteroatoms, those are called aromatics. And those are the two classes of compounds that most people are looking at, especially these ones up to 40 carbons big. That's what everybody focuses on. But there's a whole lot more of the oil around. So I'm just, for this group to have an idea, there's more to it than that. And there are that more aromatic rings, more heteroatoms gives them the most polar fractions with origins and acetylines. And so just that introduction. And so when oil spills into water, well, with that whole mixture of compounds there, it's, you look at the oil, it's not just one, it's all those millions of compounds really that are in there. And so what you have from it is that as it's sitting there, first of all, the smallest ones, which are those volatile ones, the VOCs and some of the SVOCs, they will actually evaporate. What's left behind has higher density, lower density in it, but on average, the oils will be tending to float until they get quite weathered. From that, you can have parts that kind of come out and disperse as droplets, or they can actually dissolve. Parts that dissolve can be biodegraded. Also, microbes can work right at the oil-water interface, and both of those are kind of eating the oil. Once it goes into the water, once you start getting parts in the water, then it can mix up with sediment that's there. And sediment, as you know, is little rocks, sand, little rocks. So if the oil interacts with that, well, then that just pushes it down to the bottom. So you end up with oil in the bottom. But also, as it weathers, very aromatic compounds that are in there actually have higher density than the water itself. So parts of the oil, too, can just sink by itself because of its composition. And with all this, if it's out on the surface, the sun can shine on it, and that also changes it and will oxidize it. So really, in the Earth atmosphere, in the Earth's carbon cycle for regenerating, carbon is going from breaking it down with photooxidation, biodegradation, other processes to produce the CO2 that gets used by the plants, that with the sun that produces oxygen, that grows plants. It's a cycle that goes around. And so petroleum becomes part of that cycle when it gets spilled. And I'm not sure if this one helps yet. I'll leave it. You could look at it later. But that concept of what happens once it's spilled is that if you just look at the first two columns here, if you have a diluted bitumen, it has a little bit of VOC, a little bit of the SVOCs, and vacuum residue. Once it's gone, what's left behind now is higher SVOCs and resid, none of that left. Similar, if it's a crude oil, it starts off with having VOCs. With weathering, it loses it, which means that these parts increase because you've now concentrated them because that part's gone. For gasoline, well, it's mostly a VOC. So if it's gone, then all you have left is a little bit, and it's quite small, so it would probably be biodegraded. Diesel has a little bit of this, but most of it will be staying somewhere. But again, it's small, quite small. It'll be biodegraded. If you have bunker, there's no VOCs, so there's nothing. You don't have to worry about any gases coming off of that. But you just basically will have these parts that are still there to need, that will be in the environment and to whatever impact they would be having. And I have a whole lot of details. This is taken actually from the paper I was mentioning, kind of explaining where toxicity could come in and not. But really, the acute toxicity, it comes from the VOCs. They tend to leave fast. The more chronic comes from pHs, which are in this fraction, and which people monitor, and those are more concerned. And of course, for the heavy part, they aren't toxic, really, not really thought of toxic. That's the asphalt on the road. But yet that can have smothering effects. So it really depends where it goes, how much it goes, as to what kind of impacts there can be. And so just kind of summarize what I was talking about. So for evaporation, if you've got a lot of evaporation coming off, then that's the air quality for responders immediately and for people around. But then once it evaporates, then it's gone, and then it can move in to clean it up. For if it's floating, it's the easiest to recover. If it submerges, it's harder to find. If it's dispersing, it's also hard to find. If it disperses and there's a whole large volume of water and it can disappear in quotation marks, it's so low concentration that it doesn't cause any, it's below toxic levels. It's, not, low concentration, low enough concentrations, then it doesn't cause any effects. But that gets to be more problem if you're in a river situation, because rivers have bottoms very close. And so if it disperses, it disappears from the surface, but then it could be all along the bottom. And that can work even for light products like kerosene or gasoline. You can still have that problem. It disperses, it evaporates, it disperses, but then if it interacts with sediment, then it can be there. So again, each time it's whether really depends on the water type of water body it is as to how it'll behave. Once it's the oil's in the water, it can create emulsions, which makes a larger volume to be having to recover, makes it harder to pick up. Cementation, of course, that means it's sinking, so it's hard to pick up on the bottom. And stickiness, that's if it gets on a shoreline. That's why you want to avoid have it hit a shoreline, because once it stick to rocks, sticks to the vegetation on the shore, then it's really hard to clean up. And with that too, all the oils are different, whether they're conventional crude, whether they're pipeline products of some sorts, if it's oil by rail, whether it's Bakken or diluted bitumen, all these things will be different. Diluted bitumen will not move too far from the tanker if it rolls out, because its viscosity, will stop it. Well, if you have Bakken, as we saw in Milgantic, it caused a lot of damage. So anyway, that's considerations. And then of course, once you have the final products, well, then they each have their own ways that they will be acting for the hydrocarbons or organic compounds they have in them. Okay, so with this, I see I need to pick it up a little bit, but so basically this is illustrating our tank facilities where we can have it, we can control. We're using North Saskatchewan River water. We have the 1,200 liters, which gives us, we use 10 liters of oil to have a 5 millimeter thickness on the surface. And then we add sediment, we can have waves, temperature control. And the first tests that we've done, we have all the weathering processes happening, including biodegradation and taking samples for toxicity testing. But at that point, we had no sun, so no photooxidation. So going into the future, we now have the setup for photooxidation, so we can see what those effects are. And because it's completely controlled, we're doing tests here. We had 4 weeks. We've been up to 5 weeks of tests to see what happens, oil, water, sediment. And from these, just to highlight that, as it's weathering, whether it's conventional crude or a diluted bitumen, as it's weathering, you start with lower density, and then as it loses the light ends, higher density, lower density for starting bitumen, higher density. Similarly with the viscosity. Now this is kind of a backwards plot of what it was, but anyway, as the temperature goes up, then as it weathers, it goes from lower viscosity to higher viscosity, lower viscosity, higher viscosity, and both of these have temperature effects, which can be important, especially in the diluted bitumen one when you are getting close to the density of water. And the one other concept, because we have a system where we can study everything, we could actually measure how much is lost to the air, how much is in the water column, how much is in the floating oil, and basically floating on the shoreline is like how much stays up and then how much goes in bottom sediment. And at the same temperature, this was a diluted bitumen compared to this being a conventional crude. And so you'll see that as light ends, the VOCs escape, and a whole lot is left behind to be recovered for the diluted bitumen. While for the conventional crude, you have a whole lot of loss from evaporation. You have a portion that is available to be recovered in our system. And the interesting part is that there's a whole lot, even though it's floating and they look the same between the two tank tests, between the conventional and the diluted bitumen, we found that the sediment actually had a whole lot more oil that had left, compounds had left the oil in the conventional crude and mixed with the sediment. So up around 10% compared to only 1% for the diluted bitumen, which is actually agrees with research, lab research in the past that shows that the mixing into the water depends upon viscosity. Conventional crude has lower viscosity, so it mixes in the water much. Once it's mixing into the water, the sediment can interact with it. So basically that's the results between a diluted bitumen and conventional crude. And we found that with temperature for the diluted bitumen, it didn't really change too much. You had the similar kinds of evaporation, a little bit less, a whole lot left to be recovered, and little interaction with the sediment. Okay, and so then for sort of the final section, so the idea while we have this system, it was North Saskatchewan River water, it was North Saskatchewan River sediment. So we want to take to see what the microbes were doing. And often, people will be saying, oh, well, you can't see the oil, so it's going to be biodegraded. And my PhD is actually in biochemistry. So I take exception to that just because, microbes can't do all of it. The Earth system can do it, but, can't just say that the microbes are going to do it because it needs more than the microbes. But anyway, just to illustrate that, so the microbes, they're opportunistic. They're looking for organic compounds to eat so they can grow, and it uses energy sources. They're actually there because, as I mentioned, the Earth is a carbon recycling system. So as you know, plants die, animals die, or, things die, decompose, gets recycled. That's part of that system. So those microbes are all there to do that to begin with. So having oil there just means it's a different carbon source for them to work on. But they can only work on what's either in the water or at the oil water interface. And so how much can it be biodegraded? And here I'll just, there'll be a reference to look at this. This is basically how we're envisioning that you start off with that whole living system that went through to create the oil that has the various compounds. Some parts of the oil can be totally biodegraded to CO2, but the bigger ones, and especially the more polar ones, actually will get partially oxidized and be similar to fulvic humic acids. They'll be big. And so somewhere in there, the smallest things will get decomposed. So the toxicity would disappear, and you'll get left with the parts that just act like dirt is the idea. And that is set there. And so the thing where the limitation in the research is, from my perspective, with understanding oil, is that everybody, whether it's toxicity or for the people who study biodegradation, they're always looking at pHs as the how they're monitoring it. But the pHs are not even all of the aromatics, just 40 compounds in 10,000 or whatever it would be, or 50,000 or whatever number that would be in that mixture. They're looking at 40 of them. And so they are representative of it, but they aren't all of them. And, so what about the rest of them? And then, of course, what about everything else? And so this is kind of complex looking, but the idea is that we saw microbial increase as we saw, and we were just monitoring pH decrease. And we did it at 2 degrees and at 15 degrees. And again, here's pH decrease as microbial increase. Different microbes were doing different things at the different temperatures. But the interesting thing was that less of the pHs were released at lower temperature, which makes sense. The oil is more viscous, so can't get out as much compared to what happened at the 15-degree test. And interesting as well, at warmer temperature, it was just a few days till it got down to where as much as it could digest, while for the cold temperature, it took longer to get there. But in the end, there's something left over, some pHs that the microbes weren't getting very easily. And so they would, they would be there. So with this is the summaries. The pH contents are indicators for polyaromatic compounds, but they don't measure all of the polyaromatics. And from the chemistry perspective, the rings that are highly alkylated or that include heteroatoms such as sulfur, nitrogen, oxygen, they are not part of what's being looked at there. So it's only a part of the picture. The oil spill degradation in freshwater demonstrates different aspects of behavior. So the most significant loss of oil was at all times is from the evaporation of compounds that are smaller than C13. So those VOCs I was talking about, and a little bit of the semi-volatile compounds. Major portions of the oil form floating mats and will do for a long time. We were running tests up to 5 weeks. Now, of course, that can be influenced if a whole bigger waves or heavy rainstorm or out in the environment, you have weather, and so weather can cause things, can impact that, and also having photooxidation also is important to that, and so we weren't including that in these first tests. But still, even when you have that, there will be portions that will be dispersed in the water. Some will be dispersed, and then with the dissolution of the oil compounds of water, as the water increases, you actually get more dissolved. But in the end, how much can be biodegraded? So, as I said, the microbes can only eat what's in the water at the oil-water interface, and they can only completely eat the compounds they can sort of fit into their enzyme systems, and so they can't necessarily eat everything. And so what they'll do, they'll eat parts of it and leave them carboxyl groups, leave them as acids behind. And so what happens with that? So smaller, including toxic compounds, C10 to C40, will tend to be removed by dissolving in the water because they'll be small enough. Once they get oxidized, they'll really like the water, they'll dissolve and maybe float away. So they get removed by being dissolved. For the larger ones, that even though they've been oxidized, they're still insoluble. Well, maybe that doesn't matter because they would be behaving more like humic substances, mud, and so they could become environmentally benign. That would sink and just kind of add to the carbon sources of the environment, and they could sink due to the density of droplets, interaction with sediment, or becoming part of marine snow, which is what the microbes actually create at the time. But they may not be. Generally, could be okay. That being said, though, if they actually go down on a resource of a sensitive area, and get smothering, then that's a problem. And they don't have, so that's an issue. But if they can, it's just in terms of how much and where. So once they're down there, there's other organisms, other processes. I'm sure there's people out there, the more zoologist people, or people who know about the benthic creatures, or the worms, the planktons, the phytoplankton, all these various other creatures that I don't know anything about, but they would all be doing what they would do to it. So other organisms and processes could you make use of the partially oxidized compounds and use them as carbon sources and substrates. And so it just kind of joins the Earth's carbon source. And so I pose the question again, these are the same questions. The microbes are there. They eat what they can. How much can be biodegraded? In terms of that total mass of the oil, from the bio, meaning the microbes, not much can be, really not much, because, and we don't really know because we aren't monitoring most of it. So we don't know how much is gone. And from our tests over 5 weeks, we could see pHs had gone down, but still we had, 80%, 40%, of the oil that was floating. So obviously, from the visual, most of it's still there. Now, does it matter? Eventually, no, because it's carbon. The earth knows what to do with carbon. But really, the research comes into when, where, how, where it ends up, what other organisms are in, what kind of water body, how much, so all of that to me is like the research of the future to figure out where it is. And certainly photooxidation will fit into this. Photooxidation will destroy the oil in ways that the microbes, so there could be a synergy between the photooxidation, breaking it up so that then the microbes can work on it. And, so that's a possibility, but again, all that work needs to be done. And I'm getting close to retiring, so I can't do it all. So others of you have to take it up. And so with that, that has to be determined. And so with that, I acknowledge, funding from the Oceans Protection Plan, and most of the work that I was doing there was done with Dr. Shinzen and Dr. Nayera Sabaramanesh, who were scientists in my group, Chin running the tanks and Nayera, the microbiologist. Oil and water analytical groups did all the chemical analyses, except ALS Global did the polyaromatic hydrocarbon analyses. I appreciate that CAP provided the oils that we needed for studies. EPCOR Utilities, which is the water utility for Edmonton, supplied the river water. And Natural Research, Maria Elias at NRC actually did the genetic work for us at that time. And here I'll just kind of put this slide up. Now, these are the papers that we have so far on these topics. And so I just sort of pulled from many of them, so that, pulled a few slides from them just to illustrate the points. But I could talk for an hour on any of the topics. And I'll just kind of, let's see, I think, it's just my email at the end. So I'll just leave that there if people want to take a picture or whatever. And with that, it's time to stop stalking. Kelsey, I give up the mic. I'll answer some questions, and I'm sorry I did go a little bit longer.
No worries, Heather. And I'm going to turn it over to Pat Charleboy to facilitate the Q&A. And reminder to folks, just please type your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom toolbar.
Thanks for that, Heather. That was really interesting. We had a question about your slides. We will be posting the recording of the webinar, but we had a specific request for your slides. I don't know if you're comfortable making those available or not.
I am.
If we can post those.
Yeah, we can.
Cool. Okay. Thank you. That'll be great. And as questions are coming in, I have one that I wanted to ask. It was about you talked about the biodegradation, and that not much is happening. It's my recollection, which could be faulty, but that the oil spills that happened in the US within the last, let's say 20 years or so, that the biodegradation was a big part of the cleanup process, and like they augmented the naturally occurring microbes with ones that they added. Is that not the case, or it's not, like it's really just a very small tool in our cleanup?
Okay, with all these things, the prime focus has been on the toxicity of the oil. And so when they monitor biodegradation, they tend to do things like measuring BTEX and measuring pHs and looking for things like sheen, basically are the ways that they're looking for it. And those things are all indicators of parts of the oil. But, pH is, if you get into that, they're talking about amounts, even when they're measuring in the oil, it's like a few percent of the oil, and they're looking for what comes out in the water, looking for the detection. So when things go below the detection limit for those things, then they say that it's clean. But they are not in any way looking for the asphalt that's left. They aren't looking for the bunker B that's left, per se. They are looking for the pHs. And so, from my, whole oil perspective, I would be saying, well, no, it's still there. But the fact that the most toxic things are the smallest things, and the good news there, those are the ones that can be biodegraded, or that other organisms around can do something with, or they get oxidized and float away. Like once they get oxidized, they're now water soluble. And so, like for instance, shoreline cleanup, they'll put it into the zone where the waves come, and then it disappears. Yay! But what happens is that the sun and the microbes are oxidizing it, and once it puts carboxyl groups on it, from the chemistry perspective, well, now it's water soluble. And so then it will just release itself. It doesn't want to be with oil anymore, release itself and float away. So it will have gone somewhere, and it's not affecting anything because, the toxicity comes from the concentration. And if it's dilute and floating around out there, nobody will care, nothing will care, so it's that kind of, it's that dynamic. And so that's how come, and so that works, say, if you've got a big lake and a shore and it floats off and it's good, it's fine, it's gone. And they can add some nutrients to try to improve it. But the microbes, they have capabilities to kind of engulf it. And then they have inside their little enzyme systems, well, to cleave those bonds, most of them have to have, it's a lock and key thing. So in the end, the molecule has to fit into the key, into the key, into the lock, sorry, that so that then the enzyme can do its chemistry. And if it's too alkylated, or, too alkylated, well, then it's too big. It won't fit. And so then it can chew along the chain, but once it gets to the ring, well, it can't do anything. So then now you have this ring system with a carboxyl group and floats away. And I've seen it from the other side in the oil sands. The reason that the oil sand bitumen is so viscous is a bitumen. It started off as a conventional crude, but it's ended up as a bitumen because it's biodegraded. And so in the asphaltenes, the biggest molecules, there are acids, so they are biodegraded, even being big molecules. And it's just because the microbes can chew on the chain, but then it's left, so those molecules, those biggest ones, are not going to cause anything. The asphalt, we don't consider asphalt toxic. Our roads are all made of asphalt. We put it on the roofs. People, so those molecules are okay, but they look for those specific smaller ones, and those are what disappear, and that's how they judge it. So I'd say, that's a thing. They can improve it, but they're always looking for the pHs. And by the way, as pHs get oxidized, they disappear, because the whole method for how they measure the polyaromatic hydrocarbons, they filter out anything that has oxygen on it. That's removed. In that separation by polarity, once the oxygen's on it, it now becomes a resin or an asphaltene. So it just takes itself out of the picture. So the fact that the concentrations went down, they may even still be in the water as acids, as what they'd call, as organic acids, but they are no longer measured as pHs. So this is what I'd like people to understand. And if they then see after that's happened that nobody's toxic, the studies show it's no longer toxic, all this, then that's fine. But from my pragmatic perspective, well, it's still there, but it just floated away. And it will be fine. It will get eaten, or it'll be just part of the earth, part of the earth with the organic composition of the earth. But anyway, so that's a long answer, and then nobody can ask any more questions.
Thanks, Heather, so much. We do have one more question, and we'll answer that offline. But thank you so much for this presentation, for answering our question, and future questions to come your way via email. And thank you to the webinar participants. Please remember, webinar participants, to check out our website, where there are a treasure trove of archived webinars on a variety of topics. And thanks again, Dr. Heather Dettman. Really appreciate your time today.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I look forward to anybody's questions if they want to follow up. Thanks.